Hello and welcome to Discover History's YouTube channel, and today we're celebrating in a way World Bee Day. And this isn't going to be a talk all about the bee day and the invention of it in bathrooms up and down the country. We're looking specifically at the insect known as the bee. And the interesting thing about the bee is it's been celebrated throughout history. If you go back to the ancient Egyptians, for example, you do see a lot of carvings and drawings of bees, and that's really down to the fact that they saw, in a way, the importance of them, and that's what we're starting to embrace now in 2020 really. They're great pollinators. For example, the Egyptians had some understanding that they were helping crops grow, for example, in vegetables and things like that. So they understood to a certain degree that they were great pollinators. But the other big thing is the ancient Egyptians, just like the Romans as well, also saw that honey, specifically honey that came from bees, had medicinal properties. We even know that today. By the Middle Ages, bee honey was actually being used to draw out infections inside wounds. For example, arrow wounds, you do sometimes get a mention of the drizzling of honey or oatmeal poultices with honey on the surface being used literally to take the nastiness, the pus, for example, that starts to accumulate with an infected wound. So throughout history, bees have been celebrated. It's just sad that really the last 20-30 odd years people haven't really seen the importance of the bee. It's only now in 2020, shall we say, really, that people are realizing that they're important for pollinators. And most people say, most naturalists actually say now, that without bees there wouldn't really be life on earth as we know it. And it is quite a scary thought, what insecticides and things like that could actually do to bee populations. So today we are celebrating bees, and in particular how they've generated light for us over the years. Now, most people in the past would get up when the sun came up and they went to bed when the sun went down. There was no point really staying up after that. If you think about farmers today, farmers still live, I always say, with that mentality. So you will find farmers, especially in the summer, out in their fields from about 4 a.m. if not earlier, and then you will see them out in the fields until the sun starts going down, and then they go home, they eat, and probably go to bed ready for another early start the next morning. So our ancestors throughout history thought the same way. They would get up with the sun and go to bed when the sun went down. When we have a population even as far back is sort of the Iron Age, and that when people weren't really reading, there was no real reason to stay up after dark anyway. There isn't really much you can do. Some people say, well, people would have been sat there sewing away. Well, not under sort of the light of a fire. It's not the greatest light to be doing any sewing to. So people generally didn't need lighting for a very, very long time. When we have the central hearth in the middle of the home, that gives out a certain degree of light. And you have to remember the hearth is important. It's for cooking, it's for warmth, it keeps animals away, and more importantly, it does actually light a room. But when you get to the first use of lighting, and I'm not talking about Roman lighting as in with oil lamps and so on, I'm talking really about candles. We often think of the candle being something like this. This is a beeswax candle, and they are interesting in its own right, because medieval people, and in anyone really using beeswax candles, would have seen that the homes that the bees live in is a very useful fuel as such. Really, it works really, really well, and they would have started melting these homes down, these combs down, and creating big blobs or big pots full of wax. And someone at some point must have took a piece of string and dipped it in the wax, and then found that when the wax went cool and solidified, it actually made the bit of string burn much slower. So it acted as quite a controlled fuel, really, waxes. this beeswax candle here is one that we use when we're doing workshops or talks on the past, and this one's actually been made in a mould, but most candles were actually dipped. So what you do is you took the string, you had your beeswax, your cleaned beeswax in a pot, and then you dipped the string into it. So this is what you would end up with. So you dip it in, you take it out, you leave it for a few moments just to go hard, and then you dip it again. And this is hand dipping candles. Most beeswax candles were made in this way. As I mentioned, there was moulded candles. They come along a little bit later in history. And what I've got here is actually an late 18th century candle mould. And what you would do is you'd put the wicks in there, and then when you finally get the candles out, they will be a more even shape than something that you hand dipped in the wax, putting them in, taking them out every 5 minutes. But beeswax candles, and like I said, we're celebrating bees today, beeswax candles were only something that the rich, the upper classes, could afford. Throughout history, beeswax candles, because they smell so sweet and they give off a bright light, they were always reserved for those of the upper classes. But saying that, upper classes would go to bed when the sun went down as well, 99% of the time. But at one point in the Middle Ages, beehives, for example, if you own bee skeps, the straw the straw domes that bees set up homes with, you had to have a license for it. The Pope actually gave licenses away, and you had to pay a hefty sum to buy these licenses. So beeswax candles were not something everyone had. There is an alternative to the beeswax candle, and that is what is often referred to as the poor man's candle. And the poor man's candle is when you go outside, usually late summer, so August into September, you go down to where there's some wetland, possibly marsh area or down by a river, and you cut down, you harvest what is known as the common rush, like that one there. Now, the common rush very much looks like a straw, and it's got an outer layer, and what you have to do is you very carefully peel off the outer layer, but you do have to leave one strip of the outer layer, and that really keeps it rigid. And what you would have is the soft pith on the inside. Remember, you always keep that one piece on to keep the rigidness of it. And what commoners or poor people used to do is when they got their meat, and remember, meat was not a common thing for the poor, but when they had meat, they never wasted a thing. They used the bone. If it was a cow, they used the horn. If it was deer, they used the antler. They used everything, and they even used the fat. And what they would do is they would take their rushes that they've prepared, and they would soak them or trail them through a drip tray, and coat it in animal fat, and that would have been the poor man's candle. It wouldn't have been as thick as a candle. It pretty much looked like that. It's just a piece of rush with the outer layer stripped off, with it soaked in the animal fat. And unlike candles that require a candle holder, for example, I have my 17th century candle holder here. This one's made out of pewter, very expensive, but it matches the expensive candle in it. If you're having rushes, this poor man's lighting, you don't need a candle holder, obviously. And what most people had was what was called a rush light holder. And this one's made out of iron. It's very nicely made, to be fair, and a lot of them are like this. And you have what looks like some scissors at the top, the jaws of it. And what you do is you place your rush light into the jaws like that, and you light the end of it just of here. The problem with rush lights is they drip fat all over your wooden table. There's no way a commoner would have a tablecloth. The rich would, but this would be dripping all sorts of fat over your wooden tabletop. They burn down pretty quick. They only give off a small amount of light, and they give out plumes of black sooty smoke. It's quite a horrible thing. It just smells like burnt meat. Now, the interesting thing is, a lot of people in the Middle Ages and beyond, into the Tudor, even to the Stuart, to make use of them better, to create more light than they actually need, often used to set them in the centre, like that. And what they would then do is light both ends of it. And that is where we believe the saying comes from, burning a candle at both ends. We will never know for sure, but it's quite an interesting one. It probably does date from that period. But some medieval people, some Tudor people, some people even in the Georgian period, sometimes had more meat than normal, especially at the time of Easter or Christmas, the great feast days as such. And therefore, instead of using rushlights, sometimes they would take some string and dip it in the fat. And what they would create, like we have here, is very similar to a beeswax candle, but these candles are made out of animal fat, and these are what we would call tallow candles. The sad thing is these burn down pretty quick. They give off a lot of smoke, they melt very easily. They're even melting in this room on a hot day like today. But it's a cheaper alternative as such. It's the lower classes trying to think themselves better than the lower class people. But if you've got those candles, the tallow candles, then you would need a rushlight holder like this one. This has the jaws, so this would enable you to clamp your rushes in there 7 days a week, 360 odd days of the year. But let's say Christmas time, you want that bit of a celebration, then you've actually got here a ring to actually put a tallow candle as well. So yeah, a dual purpose tool, this one really. But bees are really important, and people in the past knew that as well. Remember, we were using the honey for medicinal purpose right up to pretty much the present day. We were making use of the honeycombs, the actual beeswax, and turning them into candles. And even people as far back as the ancient Egyptians realised that they were pollinating things, or for some reason plants were growing, flowers in fruit was in abundance on them for some strange reason. They put it really down to the magical thing, the bee. So hopefully this has been a bit of a brief introduction, a celebration of the bee, but a brief introduction to lighting as well. If I lived in the past, I would definitely prefer a beeswax candle over a tallow candle any day. Anyway, I hope you're enjoying the sunshine, and we'll see you tomorrow for yet another interesting video. Let us know what you want to see. Contact us, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or on here on our YouTube channel. Anyway, stay safe and we'll see you soon.